The list of Democrats trying to win the presidential nomination is one candidate smaller. Former Housing Secretary Julian Castro announced he's ending his presidential campaign. Castro was the only Latino candidate in the race and focused on issues like immigration and poverty. There are now still 14 Democratic candidates vying for the nomination, and we're nearly a month away from the Iowa caucuses and just over 300 days until the general election. 20 race, I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe and Caitlin Huey-Burns. Ed is a CBS News political correspondent, and Caitlin is our CBSN political reporter. Welcome and Happy New Year to both of you. Ed, let me start off with you. What is the Castro campaign saying about why he dropped out?
Well, he essentially said, Elaine, that there, circumstances in this race have changed, and really the essential circumstance is this: he never could get out of the single digits in any of the early states or any national surveys, and he couldn't raise money like the other candidates. He had a lot of things going for him: cabinet secretary, big city mayor, as you mentioned, the only Latino in the race, which they would think would give him some potential advantage, but ultimately just couldn't make it happen. And so he's decided to start the new year as a former candidate, and will do so. And, some will say that this is an example of the DNC's rules potentially costing somebody who otherwise would have been considered a more viable candidate. But others would say, look, he's been in this race for nearly a year. It just never connected for him. And so he's sputtered out, and we'll see. Many, of course, will say that he is a potential running mate, but I would say, with all due respect, that if you couldn't poll well enough in your home state of Texas, which is someplace Democrats would like to win back someday, if not potentially even this year, and if you polled in the single digits or not as well as other candidates among Latinos, who many thought would be a natural constituency for him, then the case for him as a running mate maybe isn't necessarily as strong as some might think.
Well, Caitlin, how have other Democratic candidates reacted to Castro's decision?
Well, there's been nothing but praise from his fellow rivals, or former rivals, I should say. They're all saying that he ran a good campaign. They praise him for getting in and for highlighting issues that they thought needed to be highlighted, especially the issue of immigration. He was the first candidate to come out with a comprehensive immigration reform plan. And it raises a question about why get out now before the voting actually begins. And for a lot of these candidates, getting out now allows them to save face, perhaps be some kind of player, even if not on the short list for VP, some kind of player in the Democratic Party. And lots of these candidates and Democratic strategists have been saying that Castro, by getting out now, has positioned himself well for some kind of future in the party.
I want to turn to fundraising. So candidates have been releasing fourth quarter fundraising numbers. And earlier, we learned Joe Biden raised $22.7 million in the final months of 2019. This is Biden's best quarter yet. It's still behind other candidates like Bernie Sanders, who raised $34.5 million. So, Ed, how significant are these numbers for the candidates?
Yeah, so we've gotten essentially four big numbers from Sanders, who raised just shy of 35, Buttigieg, who raised just shy of 25, Biden, who raised just shy of 23, and Andrew Yang, who raised about $16.5 million. Oh, look at that. There they are. and I think the more notable thing here is that Biden essentially kept pace with Buttigieg and managed to get into the low 20s. Decent quarter for him, his best one yet. He pointed out in an announcement video, his team has pointed out that he doubled his online fundraising, which is a sore point for his campaign because early on in their bid, they got called out for the fact that they were struggling to find financial support online at a time when Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, Andrew Yang, and Buttigieg were all enjoying the support of low-dollar online donations. So we don't quite know how many of those donations came from the internet and what they accounted for, but they were more than happy to point out today that his internet contributions have doubled. They also point out a big surge of that money came at the beginning of the quarter, which coincided with the start of the impeachment inquiry. And, remember, his name was being invoked. There were reports that this has all started because the president was worried about Biden as a potential candidate. So clearly they saw some grassroots support come their way over the course of the entire quarter when his name was being invoked on a regular basis during all of those impeachment proceedings, and very well still could be if a trial is held at some point in the coming weeks.
Meantime, the Trump campaign also released its fourth quarter numbers, and they raised $46 million and have over $102 million in cash on hand. So, Caitlin, how much of a concern are those figures for the Democratic candidates?
I think the biggest concern among Democrats right now is that Trump is running a general election campaign. He's been raising this money in conjunction with the RNC, the Republican National Committee. They joined forces very early on in really what was an unprecedented move, combining staff and able to raise these large sums of money. And they have, a cohesive message because it's just one candidate and it's an incumbent. So there are certainly a lot of advantages to that. Democrats are concerned that they figure to have a pretty long primary, especially when you look at the kind of money that Democrats are raising. Bernie Sanders raising all of that money shows that he figures to be a real strong contender for a long time, having the money to stay in this race. Same with Pete Buttigieg and some others. And so that's the concern that I hear from Democrats is, getting to a point where they finally have one standard bearer, one message, and don't have to kind of spend this time and money separately and can join forces. That's a big concern, especially as the Trump campaign continues to raise a lot of money. It shows he's a formidable incumbent.
Right, because it really is looking like it could be a prolonged fight on the Democratic side. So earlier this week, Joe Biden got some attention for saying that he would consider choosing a Republican running mate. Let's listen to some of that.
The answer is I would, but I can't think of one now. No. Look, no, I'm serious. No, here's what I mean. Let me explain that. There's some really decent Republicans that are out there still. But here's the problem right now of the well-known ones. They've got to step up. Do you know what I mean?
So, Ed, that was interesting to hear Joe Biden talk about that. How does that kind of answer play into his larger pitch to voters?
Well, his larger pitch is that he feels he can restore some sense of bipartisanship and respect here in Washington and therefore across the country. And so why not at least acknowledge that maybe if there was somebody, he would consider them. Problem is, Democrats as a whole probably aren't entirely thrilled by that because, as we talk about every time somebody drops out, there are plenty of people in the party right now who voters believe could be qualified to serve as that running mate. And Biden has a fair point there about the kind of Republican who would have to be willing to separate themselves from the president doesn't necessarily exist in a way that would lend themselves to being a Democrat's vice president. Or they're of a certain age where they might even be older than Biden, frankly, and wouldn't necessarily lend themselves well to the role. So, it was a reminder that he is somebody who is making a broader pitch to voters across the spectrum and has made very clear that he does not consider himself to be, while he is a liberal Democrat, he doesn't necessarily consider himself a partisan Democrat in the sense that he is willing, eager, and able to work with Republicans or anyone else who doesn't necessarily agree with him.
And I want to ask you about somebody we don't necessarily hear a lot about from the campaign trail, but Democratic presidential candidate Marianne Williamson has laid off her entire campaign staff. Ed, what are you learning about this? Is she still in the race?
Yeah, well, she apparently still is, but we'll see. Yes, the self-help author who was a character or a participant in early presidential debates, a participant in them, and later spoofed as a character, let's say, in, for example, Saturday Night Live sketches, is apparently parting ways with her entire staff, not just in New Hampshire, where she'd spent a lot of time, but across the country. Former staffer I spoke with this afternoon says she's still running. We'll see how much longer that lasts. Bottom line, for her and for everyone else who isn't raising big money, this is an expensive and daunting task. And while she certainly made a name for herself, a broader name for herself, and drew attention across the country, once she couldn't make the debate stage, as it was the case with a lot of these other candidates, she simply just couldn't hang on. And so we'll see exactly how much longer she lasts, but it's hard to do this without some hired help.
Mm-hmm. Well, finally, we are almost a month away from the Iowa caucuses and 40 days away from the New Hampshire primary. I want to get both of your responses on What is most important for the campaigns in these coming weeks? Caitlin, let's start with you.
I mean, one interesting dynamic that we've seen in all 4 of the early states is that there's no clear frontrunner for each of these states. So you could come away from the early contest without a clear consensus about who the nominee is going to be. So that's something that is really kind of fueling some of these other candidates who are not quite polling at the top of the top. They believe, especially in a place like Iowa, that there is room for growth still, because again, when you talk to candidates there, they'll still name voters there. They still name about 3 people they're considering. So there is some fluidity here, certainly. If you're a candidate like Cory Booker or Amy Klobuchar, you're spending a lot of time in Iowa and trying to make the case while you still can before having to go back, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders as well, before you have to go back to Washington and potentially deal with the impeachment proceedings. So it really is crunch time. These numbers, though, that we're talking about in fundraising give us a sense of which candidates really are in this for the long haul.
Ed, what are your thoughts on what's most important for the campaigns here in the coming weeks?
Well, what we need, frankly, is some good measurement of who's doing well. And I think we'll start to get some fresh polling next week. December is a tough month to do any kind of survey, as pollsters will tell you. So we've been entered a dark period where we're not quite sure. Did Amy Klobuchar see a bump after that last debate? Has Mike Bloomberg become more of a factor? And how is that Bloomberg strategy playing out in those states where he plans to compete? Remember, we don't poll regularly in Tennessee or Alabama or Colorado at this stage in an election. So we don't know if perhaps he suddenly has popped up into the top tier in those states and Democrats are actually thinking about him. And we may not know that for quite some time. So how does he factor into things? How do the senators who are going to get stuck in an impeachment trial here in the coming days factor in their day job with the job they'd like, and how do their campaigns continue on for them? And do Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg and others who aren't in the Senate and can continue campaigning see some kind of advantage and bump because they'll be able to be in those states while everyone else is back in Washington?
All right, Ed O'Keefe and Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you both. Let's bring in Antoine Seawright. He's a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Antoine, Senator Bernie Sanders currently tops the Democratic candidates in terms of fundraising. He raised $34.5 million in the fourth quarter. How significant is fundraising at this stage in the race?
Well, I think that is a huge number for the senator for Senator Sanders and his campaign. I think it speaks a very loud volume to his ability to not only raise money, but really tap into some sort of magic that's out there in the Democratic space that has allowed him to continue to raise money quarter by quarter, outpacing some of his opponents. Now, money makes a difference, but money makes the difference, but it does not perhaps make all of the difference. And I think that's what we're going to see, and that's what we've seen time and time again, quarter after quarter, when these massive fundraising numbers hit the news media. However, that does not always translate to support, particularly with the most loyal voting bloc in this party, African-American voters.
Well, as we mentioned, Julian Castro dropped out of the presidential race today. He was the only Latino candidate in the race. What does his departure say about the diversity of the field of Democratic candidates?
Well, what it says is that his experiences and his exposure in this race definitely has made a difference. It will continue to make a difference. But I think the voters are speaking very loud and clear by all of the surveys I continue to see. They're saying to candidates and to this process, you do not have to look like me in order to best represent my interests. That's why you see Joe Biden with his strong grip, I think, on the African-American support, particularly in places that are very reflective of the Democratic Party, starting in my home state of South Carolina. I do think that the diversity of our party will be displayed with the volume of voter participation at the polls, both in the primary and the general election. And I'm cautiously optimistic that when this process is over, African Americans in particular would have found their loud voice in this process, even though our nominee may not be a person of color.
Well, what has been Julian Castro's impact on the field? Has he managed to raise his profile during the race? And will he come away unscathed? Because, as you know, over the course of the campaign, he really kind of punched pretty hard against some of the other candidates.
Yeah, and that's fine. But I think that Mr. Castro's experience or what he brought to this race, like Kamala Harris and like some of the others who have who are no longer in this process, they were able to not only raise their profile but raise some issues that are bread and butter issues to Democrats, meaning things that will motivate people to come out. Inside the political bubble, we oftentimes think is some of the things that always pops up in polls that will motivate people to come to an election day polling place. However, most of the times, some people are motivated by things that may not show up on any given survey, and I think Mr. Castro having his loud voice sing on the choir throughout this process is going to be very helpful for the long-term health of this party.
Finally, it's now, of course, 2020. There is a debate in less than 2 weeks, and we're just about a month away from the Iowa caucuses. How much of an impact could this time have on candidates, and what are you going to be watching for?
Well, what I'm going to be watching for is how these candidates spend or use their resources based on the money they raise. It's one thing to raise large amounts of money. It's another thing to be able to put that money to good use for your long-term benefit. I think that obviously Bernie Sanders has solidified his place in this race probably until the end of this process. If not, something is definitely wrong with me, and I've miscalculated this thing the whole way. I don't know how you have raised that amount of money without being able to stay involved and stay engaged throughout the process. But what I'm going to look for now is how deep candidates focus their attention to the African-American vote. While Iowa is definitely important for some, New Hampshire and Nevada, ball game is now South Carolina. Most people will turn their attention there because we know South Carolina will carry a big stick in this nomination process. And then what happens after South Carolina, I think, will really shape the pathway to our party's nomination and to the White House.
All right, all of it just around the corner. Antoine Seawright. Antoine, always good to see you.
Just
Thank you.
around the corner. Thank you.
Take care.